Welcome to Fasken's 2023 mining series, our 13th consecutive. I'm Virginia Schweitzer, a partner and the co-managing partner of the Ottawa office, and I'm part of Fasken's global mining group. Today's session is our 8th of 9 sessions, which continue until this afternoon. Please refer to your slide if you're online for some housekeeping items. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kevin O'Callaghan, partner in the Vancouver office and leader of the Indigenous Law Group at Fasken. He will be the moderator for Accelerating Project Permitting, is Indigenous Equity an Answer? And we'll introduce today's panel. Over to you, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody. We have a number of people here in the room and many online as well. So we'll be turning our heads like really more than 180 degrees here to capture everybody in the room, but also trying to include you online as well. I'd like to start with this, that Fasken ourselves have been embarking on a process of reconciliation guided by our Reconciliation Action Plan. And as part of that journey, we believe it's important to acknowledge the land and the people who have called this place home. The land on which this building sits has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We appreciate living and working here and believe it is important to acknowledge its history. As Virginia said, my name is Kevin O'Callaghan. I'm the leader of the Indigenous Law Practice Group here at Fasken, and I'll be the moderator of today's session. We have a number of people from our practice group here on the panel and also in the audience, and I'd like to acknowledge one of our newest members, Chief Perry Bellegarde, just right here in front of me. He's the ex-national chief of the Assembly of First Nation, and having his history and understanding of the Indigenous perspective in our group has already made a big impact, and we're really looking forward to seeing how that impact can broaden out across our platform and to our clients. So as Virginia said, our session today is Accelerating Project Permitting, is Indigenous Equity an Answer? Indigenous equity is one of those topics that is very, very hot in the Indigenous law field right now. I don't think there's another topic that's any hotter. And it's always a topic as soon as you sit down at a negotiating table, and the expectations are expanding from the Indigenous communities with respect to equity. And in addition, governments have been heralding equity as the solution to many problems without giving us a lot of detail on how. And so what this panel is about is trying to grapple with the thorny issue of the amount of time it takes to permit a project in Canada, and what the concept of equity can do in that regard. And we've at Fasken been very involved in the issue of Indigenous equity, as you will hear from the panel here. And also, we've just put out a bulletin entitled 4 Trends in Indigenous Equity Participation in Canada. You can find that on our website under the Knowledge tab in the Indigenous Law Practice Group page. And in that, we discuss the initial results of an analysis that we're beginning of all of the Indigenous equity agreements that have been done in Canada. And so you'll see more from us on that. But enough of me, and on to our panel. We will be hearing from each of them in turn, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. I have some questions that were sent in advance. There'll be opportunity for you to put questions in online, as well as live here with some microphones coming around the room. First up will be Dani Bryant. Will be giving us some context regarding permitting in Canada and the idea of Indigenous equity as a fix. Dani's a member of our Indigenous Law Practice Group based in Vancouver and practices in the area of project permitting with the issues of Indigenous consultation and in the context of environmental assessment. Next up will be Sophie Langlois and Romano, who will together talk to us about what Indigenous equity actually looks like, walking us through some of the legal and practical issues that will influence exactly how equity might be implemented. Zach is a member of our Indigenous Law Practice Group in Vancouver and works on negotiation and drafting of all types of agreements with Indigenous people, including having worked on a number of deals involving equity. Sophie is a member of the group from Toronto and specializes in all aspects of Indigenous consultation and agreements with Indigenous peoples. Finally, we have our special guest, Sean Willy, right in the middle there, who will give us an Indigenous perspective on the issues of equity. We are very lucky to be hearing from Sean. Sean is the president and CEO of Nedhe Developments, which is a company owned by the English River First Nation. Sean has roots in the Dani and Métis communities and extensive natural resources experience, having worked with both Rio Tinto and Cameco. So he understands both the Indigenous worldview as well as the drivers behind natural resource development, and I really look forward to hearing his insights. With that, on to you, Dani.
Sure. Is it okay with the mic here, or should I move it?
Oh yeah, feel free to put it.
All right, so as Kevin mentioned, I'll be kind of discussing some of the regulatory context that currently exists in Canada. So governments and society at large are very aware that critical minerals are important, and it's important to get them to market quickly. Canada has recently signaled this through its critical minerals strategy, which it released late last year. And the strategy lists 5 core objectives, which include promoting climate action and environmental protection, advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and enhancing global security and partnerships with allies. The strategy says that it will meet those objectives by focusing on 6 areas of focus, which include accelerating project development and recognizing the importance of advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The provinces have similarly acknowledged that the importance of improving the efficiency of the regulatory processes to get projects off the ground. For example, the Premier of BC, David Eby, recently stated the importance of this efficiency developing at the BC Natural Resources Forum and AME Roundup. And the focus on accelerating project development is justified. Getting projects off the ground is not a simple task, nor is it a fast one in Canada. The strategy notes that it can take 5 to 25 years to get a mining project to operation in Canada, and that the projects are subject to quite rigorous environmental assessment. And the timelines for getting an environmental assessment from the start of the process to completion or to the proponent terminating the process, on average, takes about 41 months, which is over 3.5 years. And for mining projects, it's even longer, at about 50 months. And at the end of that time, 68% of projects are approved, 6% are rejected, and 26% are terminated by the proponent. This is all from a 2016 Canada West Foundation article, so it may not be perfectly accurate, but we don't yet have the results of the earliest environmental assessments from some of the new legislation which was recently enacted. So these numbers should probably be pretty accurate. But looking specifically at some of the most recent mining projects approved in Canada, it's taken around 10 years to work. 2 of them have taken around 10 years to work their way through the environmental assessment process alone. And those are the Sikunka coal mine in BC and the Marathon Platinum Group metals and copper mine in Ontario. So it's difficult to see how these slow timelines will be able to bring critical minerals to market to meet the upcoming demand. As the International Energy Agency predicts, the energy sector's need for critical minerals may increase by up to 6 times by 2040. The strategy says that it will address the issue of efficiency of the regulatory process by committing to one project, one assessment, by working with the provinces to have one assessment undertaken. But in most provinces, this process is already in action. It may be that one window assessments where you apply once to kind of get all your permits may speed up the process a bit, but it's not likely to speed it up tons because what is being assessed isn't changing. So in the strategy, the Canadian government also commits to providing, trying to address challenges faced by Indigenous peoples to be seeking to be active partners in the critical mineral value chain and in the review of projects. And this providing capacity to nations may help support improving the timelines, because a lot of nations are overrun with referrals and don't have the capacity to actually deal with the number of referrals that they're being given. The strategy also comments that it's providing funding through the Indigenous Natural Resources Partnership Program to help increase economic participation of Indigenous peoples in natural resources. The program has $80 million in contribution funding and is currently receiving intake applications. But I don't see how these are solutions to the problem. Essentially, it seems like the government has issue spotted and identified the problem, but we don't know how to fix it yet, other than doing an overhaul of actually how these processes are being undertaken. The increased involvement of Indigenous peoples and the government's focus of reconciliation and involvement of Indigenous peoples in the natural resources sector is actually very consistent with recent government legislation, policies, and plans that state the involvement of Indigenous nations and reconciliation are clear goals of the regulatory process. And this can be seen through the recent UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples legislation, both in the Canadian legislation as well as the BC legislation. They both provide a framework for the government to implement UNDRIP, including seeking free, prior, informed consent from nations. And the British Columbia Act also includes a provision that allows for BC and nations to enter into agreements either for joint decision-making with respect to projects, as well as agreements which would require consent prior to exercising a statutory power of decision. And BC has entered into its first agreement of that nature already with the Tahltan central government. And in that agreement, it applies consent-based decision-making for the environmental assessment process of the Eskay Creek Revitalization Mining Project. Skeena, the proponent, is supportive of the process. And the agreement essentially creates two parallel paths. So two parallel assessment processes, one by Tahltan, one by BC, where they try to align the timing of the two. And at the end, Tahltan makes a consent decision, BC makes an approval decision. And Tahltan is also involved throughout the BC environmental assessment process like it normally is. And without Tahltan consent, the project cannot be developed. So there's, this is the first of those agreements, and we will expect more where consent of a nation will be required in order to develop your project. So essentially, what we're seeing is an increase in Indigenous participation and focus on increased participation of Indigenous peoples, both in all aspects of the regulatory process, as well as a push to involve Indigenous peoples more in resource development projects. So these recent developments provide even more incentive for proponents to seek to align their interests with Indigenous peoples in whose territories they're operating, and to seek and obtain the consent and support for projects as early in the development of the project as possible. Early support can mitigate the risk of delay related to issues being raised late in a regulatory process, dispute resolution processes that can take place within the regulatory process, which can extend the amount of time they take, and other steps, including consensus seeking with Indigenous nations. So there is a benefit to having alignment with Indigenous nations. The question is equity an answer? Sophie?
Is this on? Yes. Okay, thanks so much, Dani. So as Kevin mentioned, Zach and I are now going to walk through what equity actually looks like on the ground, some of the key drivers, and some of the key considerations to take into consideration when structuring these types of deals as an option, and considering Indigenous equity as an option for Indigenous participation in projects, including mining projects. So what are some of the key drivers? So as mentioned, Indigenous equity is becoming more common in Canada. I think whether or not parties actually proceed with equity, I think at a minimum, you can anticipate that it will arise at the negotiation table as an option to be considered. From an Indigenous perspective, equity provides for an avenue for economic participation by the Indigenous community in projects that are built in their traditional or treaty territories. So it's a way to share in the long-term economic benefits, of course, assuming that the project is successful and profitable long-term. It also provides for a seat at the table. And to many communities, this is quite meaningful. Indigenous equity is also seen as a way to bring alignment of interest between a project owner and an Indigenous community. Of course, if you are both owners of a project, your interests are certainly aligned in terms of getting the project through the permitting phase into development. You're both interested in getting across the finish line and getting to operation. So there is a natural alignment there of interest in theory. On the proponent side, in addition to bringing into alignment these interests, equity is also a tool that can be used to help secure the very important support and at times consent by the Indigenous community, and to manage some of those project risks that arise in this regard. So as companies are hard at work developing sophisticated ESG and sustainability policies internally, which, depending on the industry, may include, in particular in mining, often include, a focus on Indigenous participation and Indigenous economic reconciliation. This is another tool in the toolbox. So notwithstanding these important drivers, it is important to recognize that equity is not a magic solution that we're all looking for to getting our projects permitted, and can in fact be quite complicated to structure. It may not always be the preferred solution or option by an Indigenous community, nor for the proponent. In some instances, the parties may look to alternative structures and options that provide for revenue or profit sharing, or other ways to share in the economic benefits that may make more sense and may align better with the goals of the parties, combined with some other oversight or participation. So there are alternatives that may in fact be preferable depending on the context and the situation. An Indigenous partner is often unique in many ways from a traditional investor who may take more of a passive approach. There's often, a stronger focus there on governance rights, on relationship building, and having an Indigenous partner may also involve more facilitation and involvement by the project proponent in terms of facilitating access to financing. In fact, in many situations, the project owner may help to facilitate or also be the party that is providing funding to finance the equity position. There are other provisions, that we see in typical equity deals around resale and exit rights, as well as voting rights and other governance provisions that do require very particular consideration and customization in these types of transactions. And lastly, but I think quite importantly, I think it's also important to recognize that equity is not a replacement for project agreements like impact benefit agreements or similar agreements that are often seen in the mining context in particular. So equity is not a replacement, but is often complementary to those other arrangements. So what I'm talking about here are those agreements that provide for procurement and contracting opportunities, training and employment preferences, other socioeconomic benefits sort of that are related to the project. So equity is often complementary to these projects. It is not often a replacement for them. There are some great examples that we're seeing sort of across the market and across various industries. As Kevin mentioned, Fasken recently, just yesterday, published a study outlining 4 different trends that we're seeing in equity projects being developed across the country. I'll leave it to you guys to have a look at the report. I won't summarize it now, but do have a look. And if you have any troubles finding it online, feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll gladly share the link. I do want to dive into some examples of some equity deals that exist across the country and across industry. The first is the Clecho all-season road project. So this was a 97-kilometer all-season road built in the Northwest Territories. The government of the Northwest Territories put out an RFP, a bid, to identify a contractor that could essentially design, build, finance, operate, and maintain this project over a 30-year period. Embedded within that RFP was an option to the Clecho government to acquire a 20% equity stake in the consortium that would eventually build and maintain this project. Tied to that equity interest was a guaranteed board seat for the Clecho government. This option was, in fact, then exercised. As I mentioned, in this scenario, there is both the equity option as well as very clear commitments to ensuring that local and Indigenous communities were given priority over contracting, procurement, and other employment opportunities. So again, we're seeing both equity and other participation on that particular project. Another one is the Watay Power Project, which Fasken acted on. This was an 1,800-kilometer transmission line project that connected 16 remote communities across northwestern Ontario and connected them to the grid. Previously, they were reliant on diesel generation. And this was actually built as a group of, so there were 24 First Nations that owned 51% of that project, with Fortis owning the remaining 49%. And over time, there are options for the Indigenous partners to become a whole 100% owner of that particular project. Within the mining space, and again, not everything is publicly available for us or for us to share, but Osisko, just a few weeks ago, they shared news that they had recently issued common shares to a First Nation, the Williams Lakes First Nation, regarding their Caribou Gold project located in central BC. What was interesting about this was that, so the initial grant of 10,000 shares was granted as part of a participation agreement that they had entered into, but that there are in fact 50,000 more common shares that will be issued upon meeting of certain milestones. So again, the equity in this transaction is actually tied to meeting of certain milestones. I'm assuming that is within the regulatory sphere. Once they obtain certain permits or meet certain phases of the project, additional equity is then granted to the First Nations, as well as other funding being provided. So lots of examples to look at in the market, many of which we're involved in, but others not. And so it's very interesting to watch and to see how this is all developing. So when equity is on the table, there are some important considerations and questions to first ask ourselves and the parties. So I'm going to quickly set the stage on some of these initial questions, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Zach, who's going to get more into the details. So first, what are the objectives of the parties in seeking co-ownership of the project? And can equity best deliver on those objectives. So if the most important thing for a First Nation is to have very strong governance rights and board seats, but they're only being granted a 2% interest, often governance and ownership are related. And so, you do need to take a step back and really understand what are the goals and what is equity actually providing to see if alternatives also need to be brought to the table. Secondly, whether the project will involve one or more Indigenous community. We've worked, again, I gave the example of Wate where there were 24 nations. Others in particular in the mining may involve one or two. And if there is more than one Indigenous community, how will the allocation of shares be determined? So lots of questions there and things to iron out. The timing and stage of the investment, there are some important tax implications there to be considered. The overall and anticipated economics of the project, including the potential financial risks, are quite important to understand from the beginning. Is financing available? And if so, at what costs? What are interest rates looking like? What happens if an Indigenous party wants out? You have to think ahead of time. What are the resale? What are the exit rights? And what does that look like? Is consent or support being provided by the Indigenous community as part of the equity transaction? I think it's fair to assume that those two would go hand in hand. But again, there is a little bit of ironing out that has to be done there. So lots to consider when considering equity as part of the Indigenous participation. So Zach, over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. So as Sophie mentioned, there's really a trend in the market, definitely in the area, in the mining space and elsewhere, where nations are actively expressing an interest in the opportunity for more influence as an owner, but the ability to participate in profits if risks for the project, environmental, cultural, social, otherwise, can be adequately managed. So the specific issues that arise on these types of transactions, whether in the context, and it's important to understand the context, it might be a greenfield IBA, you're building a new project, you're trying to secure consent support. It's different than if you're dealing with an auction process or an option process where you've got a sign and close, as opposed to something that's going to be more longer in terms of timing and drawn out. Really, there's no one-size-fits-all approach here, but as Sophie mentioned, the overall structure drivers, the transaction you're going to be designing is going to be driven by the interests and the considerations Sophie outlined, project-specific risks as well, tax, as Sophie mentioned, nature of the deal, as I mentioned previously, but also the sequencing. Hard to generalize in terms of what's typical, but there are some material negotiation and deal terms that come up typically with respect to these transactions. Before we get into those, but it's first, I think, also important to understand the terminology and take stock as a negotiator at the table as to how people across you may be understanding what you're talking about. I think for many of the corporate finance lawyers and others in the room, there's a distinct understanding about what equity participation means. From that perspective, it's analogous to equity participation in corporate finance and governance circles. You have shares in the company. Your shareholder participates in the business, contributes funds, shares in the profits, risks the losses, and has the right to vote in general meetings. In the context of Indigenous negotiations, participation is going to have different meaning. Participation is linked to, increasingly, as Dani mentioned, international norms and standards of human rights. You've got UNDRIP. Article 5 talks about the UN Declaration talking about Indigenous people's rights to participate fully in political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. Article 18 talks about Indigenous people's rights to participate in decision-making processes, matters that would affect their rights. And in the mining space, Indigenous participation means typically in the IBA context far broader than what it might mean in a corporate governance circle. It's talking about participation and benefits and commitments from the company in a full range of aspects. It's financial, but it's also cultural. It's social protections, the environmental commitments, all the rest that comes with it. The word equity also carries meaning. So it's broader than potentially the corporate finance perspective. It could carry the meaning of justice, fairness. So you put that together, it's important to understand and be cognizant of your counterparty, if you're a company, as to what equity participation means. What is meaningful? It may be a lot different than what you think if you ask your accountant or your legal advisor. Important at these types of agreements as well to understand the context for how your project fits in. So you're talking about equity. It fits into a context for the nation. There's historic grievances potentially with the Crown. It could be with your project based on prior conduct. You could be looking to build a relationship. You could be thinking about governance. You got to think about the strategic objectives of the nation across me to try and figure out how it fits in, how to message it appropriately so you can structure a commercial deal that addresses that context. In terms of the commercial terms with an equity deal, again, as Sophie mentioned, there's recent examples where issuances of shares have gone common stock to Indigenous nations. There's other contexts where there's a more detailed ownership structure at a higher level of ownership interest. When thinking about what those material terms are, and just to talk about a few, given the time we have, the first consideration, one of them, is essentially the ownership structure of the Indigenous investment vehicle you're dealing with. Whether the transaction involves one or more nations investing on their own or together with other co-owners, it's common that the transaction is going to require that the owner of the shares or the owner of the interest, partnership units, whatever it is going to have to be structured in a way where that vehicle is owned beneficially by the nation. There's also going to be lender requirements potentially. That will drive how a structure will need to look, both from the company side and from the nations, if you're thinking about a true co-ownership structure outside the context of strictly issuing shares. For the purposes of equity investment from a nation side, and for what we've seen in major resource projects, the most commonly used or preferred vehicle for nations to acquire an ownership interest is limited partnership. For nations constituted as bands under the Indian Act, the limited partnership gives it's tax efficient, protects the project income from tax. At the same time, affords limited liability protection, and it can be also structured to provide for direct managerial and governance involvement in the project. The key to the success in this aspect for both sides really is making sure that there's enough diligence done to understand what the structure needs to look like early. And in many cases, that means finding ways to support a nation to make sure they have advisors that can actually understand and advise as to what the structure needs to look like from a financeability perspective, so that they can acquire capital at competitive rates. As Sophie mentioned, the timing of the investment is key. It's often a critical consideration, particularly in greenfield projects like IBAs, and that's because if funds are provided too late in the development timeline, it can create a taxable disposition in the hands of the asset owner. Not ideal if you're the company in that context. At the same time, restrictions on investment we talked about briefly, but the circumstances in which a co-owner can exit or sell out of the joint venture are going to be typically carefully negotiated, and the exercise of those rights have fundamental implications for the project and the remaining co-owners. And one of the simplest approaches is to exit rights is essentially a requirement that an owner looking to sell its interest must get the approval of other owners. And in the context of, for instance, limited partnership, more complex layered rights are going to come on top of this. And in situations where an Indigenous equity arrangement contains a prohibition on divestment, it's usually time limited, creates a risk that over time, the commercial alignment Dani discussed, and Sophie as well, may evaporate. But restrictions on divestment, including a right of first refusal, can alleviate some of that risk by making divestment less desirable. Financing, it's a key issue for both nations and companies in terms of access to capital to fund the initial equity ownership investment. An Indigenous group may, depending on the context of taking it, from a company perspective, may be able to fund independently, in whole or in part, their initial equity contribution through a combination of its own source revenue or government sources. Funding can also be sourced through private lenders, bond financing, government programs, revenue sharing, other means. And due to the lack of credit history of some communities, the cost of borrowing can greatly exceed the rate of return on projects. And in cases where nations don't have access to financial resources, their capital contribution is often dealt with on an earn-in basis. So there's various ways to do this, but generally it's a loan made by to the nation to provide the contribution or to fund the purchase. So the loan is really repayable over time in these circumstances based on the nation's share of the project income. Otherwise, the loan is typically not, it's typically non-recourse or limited recourse to the nation, so that it has little or no business risk apart from its earnings. And the loan may or may not be interest-bearing, and any interest payable is usually in favorable terms to the nation. Apart from the payment of the acquisition price or equity investment that will be paid at closing, the extent to which co-owners are required to make additional ongoing financial contributions is another key point to be dealt with. So if an Indigenous owner is unable or unwilling to contribute to subsequent capital calls, the interest may be diluted unless they're able to finance those additional equity contributions. And for this reason, typically going to see where an equity interest is contemplated outside the context of purely issuing shares, an Indigenous community is going to seek anti-dilution protections. Certain cases, co-owners may either build in optional or mandatory mechanisms around capital calls to allow for the non-funding Indigenous owner to obtain a carry or a temporary loan from the company. And these arrangements can also take a wide variety of forms, but include features like loan capital amounts being repaid out of the non-funding owner's distributions until they're fully funded, and the non-funding owner being entitled to a grace period within which to repay any capital call shortfall before any dilutive or other measures apply. So in governance, obviously a key and critical investment issue, transaction issue, is with respect to governance and control rights. The key point of discussion and negotiations in this area typically circle around rights to appoint directors and officers to corporate boards, rights to appoint representatives to management and other operating committees, which may be delegated certain key management functions, and rights to approve matters of material importance to the business or the project. Unanimity may be required on some matters, where a true, ownership structure is contemplated in a sense of an LP or otherwise. And it's particularly where unanimity what shows up in our experience has been around distributions where financing is conditioned on it, but majority or supermajority thresholds can apply elsewhere. Other common areas of approval rights for First Nations owners relate to contributions or cash calls and fundamental changes to the business or partnership actions such as dissolution. But the key is ensuring that the government structure, whatever it takes, whatever that governance structure takes, is efficient, facilitates decision-making between the parties, while at the same time avoiding the deadlocks and providing that key decisions can be made when required. We talked briefly about some of the other equity-like arrangements that Sophie went through, and I think it's important to just kind of look at the market. Like there's a number of situations recently where there's the Tall 10 agreement, equity deals happening, Cisco with theirs, others that are coming in the market, but access to capital is a barrier in a lot of cases. It's expensive. Equity participation is also extremely high value. Like it adds time, takes time to negotiate. It adds business complications, including with respect to governance generally, for reporting issuers specifically. So it's typically reserved for a situation where you've got a need to get alignment and a high strength of claim situation. The amount of equity is going to be determined by a number of factors, ultimately earnings, profitability of the project, the facility, but as I said, financing as well. So while there's, as we talked about it, an increasing discussion of equity from our experience, there's definitely a trend or interest comes up at the table. But really, in a lot of cases, it's more, at this stage, more often and frequently discussed than actually used in the mining context. Where there's a structure, an equity structure, it's definitely more prevalent from our view in respect of junior or project development companies where equity provides a means to share, sometimes in the future sale of the project. But at the same time, many nations are sophisticated. They've negotiated IBAs, they've got good advisors, they're business sophisticated nations, and they're looking at other ways to exercise governance control over a project. And that can come in ways contractually through IBAs. You're on the environmental board. You've got to input into the regulatory process. You've got mechanisms to actually exercise rights that would outdo what you'd have as a shareholder in a company. At the same time, on the financial side, the terms are getting more complex. You've got commercial lawyers negotiating mechanisms to make sure that variations up and down that could impact a revenue stream for a community are minimized. And so when looking at why a nation may want to get into an equity deal, why the company may want to have a nation involved, those types of factors are definitely in view as to, you know, the alternative, what else is out there. And on balance, up to this point, those types of mechanisms, royalties, revenue sharing, along with the contractual covenants and IBAs have been what is typically shown up in the agreements that we've done. In terms of, you know, just to close out, in terms of, you know, some of the lessons we've learned or the best practices we're seeing in the market, if equity is on the table, some really practical points to keep in mind. You need to plan your deal process to accommodate the Indigenous equity steps. Company side, you know, you think of your closing agenda, you've got the approvals, you've got the consents, you've got the various aspects that need to click into place in order to close. You also need to think about the Indigenous perspective. There's community approvals. There's a governance process. At the same time, your external requirements, the TSX, securities law requirements, how that will work, making sure the nation opposite you understands the way you understand timing might look. It may not be the case that shares can be issued immediately. It may take time for those regulatory approvals are completed. Important to make sure both sides understand those potential timing issues to make sure that there aren't expectations that something is going to happen quickly when it may take some time to actually implement. It's critical to obtain tax advice at the outset as part of earlier structuring. And in determining the structure, it's important to consider potential future financing and how that can impact your tax planning and future structuring decisions. As Sophie mentioned, the anti-dilution protections need to be carefully structured, future capital and financing requirements in mind. Resale restrictions, again, need to be carefully dealt with. And fundamentally, you know, I think you need to ensure that your advisors, whether they're lawyers, whether they're accountants, whether they're investment bankers, they need to understand the nature of the negotiations. And when you're negotiating with a nation, they potentially wear multiple hats. As Dani mentioned, they may be a regulator. They, under provincial law, they're a government that represents constituents. They have obligations to their community and members. Same time, they may be an owner. So as a result, what is market in a transaction or a negotiation may not be typical of what you might see in other contexts. Important to bear that in mind in order to have success at your tables. So maybe with that, turn it over to Sean.
Thank you very much. That's outstanding background information. I'm really happy to be here today. And thanks, Kevin, for asking me to come out. Just a bit of background. I grew up in the Northwest Territories. My mom's First Nation woman from the Dani First Nation. She spent the last 10 years reclaiming her status. Always knew who her family was and really grew us up as your Dani. Don't listen to the government on what classification you are. And my dad was a resource exec. And so I grew up at a table where we didn't talk about things like duty to consult or the legal requirements for engaging with Indigenous people or the regulatory reasons for engaging with Indigenous people. It was just something that was the right thing to do. You know, I was a Northwest Territories Indigenous resident who was pretty easy to get jobs in the mining industry. I just thought I was a really good mining worker because they kept hiring me at all the different gold mining and diamond mining operations in the Northwest Territories. But the Northwest Territories just wanted to hire local Indigenous people, and it was just part of the mandate. And so that's the framework I come from. I come from a framework that this is the right thing to do from a countrywide perspective. But you have to overlay that with the context of this country. The context of this country that you have juxtapositions within the regulatory framework, where you have territorial. We've talked about BC today, which within First Nation landscape, it's a whole different kettle of fish. You've talked about the Clecho, which is in the north of 60, which is a whole different jurisdictional region, and then you have the numbered treaties. We talk about the population of this country and the basic fact that 90% of the population lives within 100 kilometers of the American border, where the wealth of our country lives in the northern half of the country, which is predominantly lived in by Indigenous people, which is a young population compared to an aging population near the Canadian border. The population near the Canadian border is clamoring for healthcare. That's where our tax dollars should go. Well, really, we should be investing in Northern Canada through infrastructure. And I do find it funny that the misalignment and not engaging with Indigenous people over the last 150 years has led us to a point now where we're rushing to solve a critical minerals skills. And it's sort of like all of our elders and leaders in the past told you so. And I want to thank those elders and leaders, because today here I am lucky enough to talk about equity involved in mining projects, where time and again in the past, our leaders need to be recognized for pounding the table, saying the hard truths and pushing those facts. So I applaud Chief Perry and his time in office and the leaders before him who opened doors, who got us those initial opportunities where I was able to go in and work as a laborer. And our community then built up the grassroots foundations for when we could then say, well, we want more than just laborer position. We want some set aside contracts. And we went out and we secured that. And you now see 3 regions of the country, the Northern Saskatchewan mining bubble, the Northern Alberta mining bubble, and the diamond mining region bubble that have spent $3 to $4 billion with Indigenous suppliers. And so, and I'm glad Sophie said that it's not one size fits all. Equity is a very tricky term. Everything depends on what the choice of the community is. That's what self-determination is. So some communities are going to jump at equity and their perception of what that equity is. But it is not a one size fits all model. It's not a silver bullet. And even IBAs, I've lucky enough to negotiate participation agreements for Cameco Corporation. We've done 5, and this is at a company that had 25-year relationships with its local communities that we're just essentially codifying the practices. And I'm lucky enough to do participation agreements or collaboration agreements with the Diavik and their 5 communities in the Northwest Territories. And what I learned is that in the Western context, agreements are agreements. They're very black and white, and you get them done and you put an implementation committee in and you put them on the shelf. From the First Nation perspective, these are living agreements that will evolve and change over time as the capacity within our communities evolves and changes over time. And as the socioeconomic rungs we achieve keep growing, we're going to keep asking for more. So once we've filled the employment gap, we're going to ask for more. And so that's just one thing that mining companies and resource companies need to be aware of, that these are living documents. And so there's always 2 points when I think when you're engaging with any Indigenous community around the world, and it is 2 points, and it's been mentioned by Zach and Sophie and Dani. It's about getting that seat at the table. What is that decision-making process? And it's been mentioned that in some regions, so in Northern Saskatchewan, because you have these large uranium projects, the regulatory regime was always very quick. The uranium mining companies had to go back and get licensed every 2 to 5 years. So the community still always had a lot of leverage. So the community still had leverage over the environmental and permitting of these uranium. So looking at equity and having a spot at the table wasn't as a priority in that situation. In the Clecho example, they were going through a self-government land claim and using the diamond mines as the final leverage to close those land claims off. So they had a lot of leverage. And De Beers actually approached the Clecho and said, listen, you guys have all the leverage, we want to give you equity. And the Clecho says, we don't want equity, it's too risky. We like the cash production payment model. It goes right into our banks. Oh, and we also negotiated that we have control over our taxation of our own people now. So the more employment we can create, all that taxation now comes back to our community. So equity might not have been their first choice. You also see other models, especially in Australia, where equity was the only thing to do. And I was lucky enough to take the Canadian model down to Australia and negotiate with some of the best people on earth, the Mardu, in Western Australia. And so Western Australia had a large uranium deposit. They were told by the environmentalists, don't touch it, it's going to kill you all. They listened. 20 years later, they said, okay, we had to wake up and realize that uranium, and we engaged them with our Northern Saskatchewan communities, created a great culture discussion, realized that this was a path forward for them. They advised us that they've always gotten equity. So here's 7.5% free carry equity, but you got to purchase the other 7.5% over the life of the mine. But there wasn't any other socioeconomic drivers within those agreements. So in Australia, when I first started to go there, you'd see all these white Toyota trucks on the side of the roads in the outback. And that was the equity money coming from the big mining companies. That's all they're paying out. So everyone's getting white Toyota trucks. There wasn't the Canadian model of workforce developments, which is the education, training, and jobs, the business development, which is the Indigenous suppliers that are supporting your mining operations. There wasn't the community engagement, where you're defining how you're going to engage the community. There wasn't the environmental stewardship rules. So again, that's what the Canadian model is, probably one of the best in the world because it's more fulsome, it's more holistic. And now we're in those conversations about equity. But do I believe that accelerating project permitting is Indigenous equity the answer? With this federal government, do all of us really believe in this room that the federal government can move faster with Indigenous ownerships on major projects? I don't, I look at how the federal government is struggling right now with their 5% Indigenous spend target. I don't understand how. Last year we put out a MOU with 2 other large First Nations, Saskatchewan, because we saw what was happening with the Trans-Canada pipeline. We saw 3 competing groups trying to purchase the Trans-Canada pipeline when they should all have been united and going after the same project together. So we saw small modular reactors, nuclear reactors. We wanted to invest in these. So the 3 largest groups where all the uranium in Canada comes from, come together and said, we want to invest in these. Well, everyone was thrown for a loop, right? How can Indigenous people want to invest in nuclear reactors? And why are you telling us this 10 years before these things are commercial? And so we're sort of like, well, we're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And so it's, and then we thought, well, what happens if we place a nuclear reactor on First Nation land? And the federal government's head just about exploded because they couldn't know how to permit it. So I really struggle with the concept if Indigenous ownership actually bought into a project, would the current regulatory regime, as Dani points out, actually speed things up? And sadly, I would say no, because they couldn't wrap their head around full Indigenous participation in that project. So, but the bottom line is this is more than just a legal question. Indigenous equity plus Indigenous full inclusion is the pathway forward to unlocking the true potential of this country for everyone. We're sitting on so much untapped potential, both in the people within the remote parts of this country, but also in the vast potential of our mineral wealth. And if we have full inclusion of Indigenous participation, that will be unlocked for the benefit of all Canadians. That will pay for the healthcare for the 90% of the people live within 100 kilometers of the American border. So, and the other, we talk about this, and one of the concepts that's coming up as we enter negotiations, right now I represent a First Nation that lives in the heart of uranium mining country. We have a lot of junior exploration companies coming out who are happy to provide share ownership into their company. It's instead of cash, it doesn't provide us a seat at the table. But we know as a community that these projects, as they evolve, a bigger player will likely come in. And so we have concerns about who are we going to have to end up dealing with in the future. But also, what is the value of our participation in your project? So, there's always these concepts about, well, the Indigenous community, you have to buy in, or we're going to give you a loan. Well, we need to come up with a common template, the value of Indigenous inclusion. Is that 25% free carry equity? I think it's nice. 25% is a good starting number. But what is that value? And I'd like to know what is the marketplace paying for that value? So I just want to finish with that. I think there's lots of good examples out there, but as we mentioned before, there's no silver bullet to this problem. I was in a conversation late last week about, well, what happens when projects like Baffinland and the Kikitani don't want to let that project move forward, or what are all these negative projects you hear about? How do we get these projects back going up again? And it leads to just not even the equity question, but about the value the resource teams see in Indigenous communities. Do you want to create a long-term partnership? Are you thinking big enough picture that you're just going out to create relationships, just to create relationships, and not because it's a legal or regulatory box to check off? Where do Indigenous communities sit on your risk registry? I often fight against this. This is one of my beefs with Cameco. They had some of the strongest support for their Indigenous communities at 88% for their mines, but they were still on the risk registry. We have to change that mindset that Indigenous communities are a strong value driver for the resource economy? And how do we start to engage practices like equity, which should be table stakes, into every discussion going forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. You give us a ton to think about and a ton to work with as we move into the question and answer part of the presentation today. Now, people watching online, you can submit questions, and there's a couple coming through. A few questions had been sent in advance, and I'll come back to those. But I'd like to start with this. And sorry, I left out you in the room. There are a couple of mics that the gentleman in the blue suit has. So if you just stick up your hand, he'll come around to you. But I'll start us off. And I noted that Sophie and Zach and Sean all talked about the concept of a seat at the table and the importance of that. And so perhaps starting, Zach, with you, and you and Sophie can split up your answer. But what are the practical ways of making that happen? I know that in the context of a joint venture, there are ways of creating a seat at the table, but often projects are pursued by a parent company and operated by the parent company and having a seat at the table at the parent company might be a broader ask than just the individual project. So how do you bridge that gap between having a seat at the table and there being really a table to have a seat at?
Well, you started off with an easy question, eh, Kevin?
Yeah.
Thanks. No, it's a good. Thank you. It's a good question. It's funny because I think in the deals we've worked on recently, and as Sean noted, there's equity should be table stakes. It's not yet there. There's mechanisms that communities are finding to ensure that what you would get through equity in an ideal form, a seat at the table, meaning control over how a project unfolds, how it's built, how it's constructed, how it's operated. You have a say. You have rights as a shareholder, rights to appoint a director. Those types of mechanisms I find typically are showing up and Sophie, please jump in if you see differently, but are coming into the more detailed committee structures that are flowing from the impact benefit agreements that we're doing, particularly around the environmental. We hear considerable, and for good reason, concern with nations who want to be sure that they're able to evidence to their citizens that they've done their diligence on a project, that they've made a decision in good faith that they can stand behind when a project is consented to. And so in many ways, those structures are where the governance rights are happening. In other contexts, what we've seen, particularly where there's a limited partnership structured, where there's, a significant equity position taken, there could be, typically, obviously, a director nominated based and proportional to the interests the company or the nation holds in that partnership. But there's the other committees that flow from that outside the IBA context, but that are again directing how decision making is happening at the company level, at the GP level, with respect to how a project unfolds. And that takes a number of forms as well. The more, successful operators that we deal with and the clients we have the pleasure of working for have figured out ways to make sure that the counterparties have the resources they need on an ongoing basis to make good decisions with the appointees that are on the board, know who they want to appoint to a GP, know who they want to appoint to a management committee, but making sure it's not, as Sean said, you're building a relationship. You're not, structuring something, chucking it on the shelf, letting it get dusty, and then hoping you never have to look at it again. It's trying to make sure you implement these structures in a way that actually operationalizes what the intent of the parties is at the outset, which is, you hope, a relationship on an ongoing basis for the project. So do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Zach. All that I would add is in the equity context, what that often leads to that is unique is potentially a board seat, depending on the level of ownership held by the Indigenous community. And in instances where there's more than one community, we've actually seen pooling of ownership interest to amount to a right to have a seat on the board. And then you have to ask, well, what does it mean to be a director on the board? Well, it's highly regulated. You actually there are fiduciary duties that attach to those responsibilities. You then need to act in the best interest of the corporation and so on. So there actually are unique considerations when taking on the role of a director and having a board seat. But from the Indigenous perspective, there may be an interest in sitting on the board. I anticipate there will be, but also to have a voice in other committees. And as Zach mentioned, what we typically see in other IBAs or participation agreements are committees that are formed for oversight over environmental matters and other joint planning committees with respect to contracting, procurement, employment, and so on. So lots of tables to be had, and it really is context specific. Yeah.
Sean, do you want to add into that?
Yeah, it's because most of the mining companies now are so large that they have so many different projects around the globe. So how do you make sure that you have a representative that has a seat at the table from a local community near that project, right? But then, I applaud those who have Indigenous participation. The mining company has led. You've had Don Deranger and Senator Harry Cook on the chemical board prior to him. You have Keith Martell on the nutrient board. You had Matthew Kuhn come on the Newmont board. But they're not just representing their community on that board, right? And so it's how do you structure that so it's project specific to the operation? And I don't know if is there the quasi model out there around that. And I think that's why our communities have been so proactive in creating local environmental monitoring boards. Like in Northern Saskatchewan, that's the first local environmental monitoring. It was the Athabasca Basin or the Athabasca Working Group and the Saskatchewan Environmental Working Group. And those sort of models were emulated throughout the country. So you still have a seat at the table. And then it does it conflict with the mandate of a board, which is evolving. I saw recently there's more ESG now on board members, but the mandate of a board is the best interest of your shareholders, a fiduciary responsibility. So how does that conflict with the role of a First Nation member, right? So we want that seat at the table. It could be done in a majority of ways. Yes, we want board positions, but people have to go in eyes wide open what that brings.
Sean, something that Sophie brought up there, which is where there are a number of different First Nations. For proponents looking at a situation where it's not simply just the simple scenario of one First Nation, one project. What is the kind of the perspective from an Indigenous community's perspective on kind of looking at proponents trying to grapple with that issue, knowing that there's more than one nation that may be involved, and maybe or maybe not that nation actually agreeing that there should be more than one nation involved.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's always pick the guy from my community, and if you pick the guy from the other community, then we'll just yell at him because we know everything about that guy. But that's what, like, I look at the example with Cameco. They picked a member of the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, then they picked a member of the Athabasca Dani. So the community I work for now, we're up next, right? Like, where's our guy, right? So and that's where you might have to create alternative measures and oversight over that project specifically, and invest in. And that's, I think, why it's important to invest in workforce development, education, and training, is to think long term that your goal is to create a board member from that community that may not work for you.
Zach, or so if you want to talk a little bit about the structures where you may not, you're offering, potentially there's an offer of equity there, but you want to include more than one nation, but maybe you have 15 nations that you need to include or you'd like to include, but you get 10 to start at the table. What do you do about the other 5?
Go ahead.
So this comes up for us all the time in BC, which and elsewhere as well. But think from the outset, critical for the company to figure out what is the aggregate amount of equity that's available for all the nations who desire to become an equity owner and that you'd like as a company to try and get a deal with. At that point, it's really critical that you also consider, are you going to tell nations you get a percent, or are you going to let nations figure out how much they like to acquire based on what they can get financing for, or what the deal might look like? As Sean mentioned, you might have a carried interest, you might have some sort of mechanism. But the idea generally being that the allocation that's arrived at, from our experience, there's a mechanism typically where there's an allocation that's self-determined, preferably. The nations tell the company, the aggregate, here's what we would like to buy up to. For instance, you might have an option to acquire up to a percent. Some nations may not acquire that full percent. If they don't, then a mechanism to deal with who takes up the remainder, and that's been seen on projects like Alberta Powerline effectively. But a lot of the work that's happening in the energy sector, particularly around this, has dealt with that issue in terms of how to make sure that you've got an allocation mechanism that allows nations to proportionally acquire, and then making sure that that reflects on the governance side as well, being able to then proportionally appoint a member to a board or management committee, whatever structure it takes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's the right approach. Give it back to the Indigenous community. Create an investment vehicle together, right? See, we have this opportunity. Let's all coalesce, and then we'll bring a name back to the board. And then it's grassroots up. We're providing the feedback. So
Now, we started this conversation by talking about making permitting faster. And, when you compare Canada to other jurisdictions around the world, we are not fast. But there is a concern that comes when you say we need to go faster. And so I'm putting this question to you, Dani. Like, does faster mean that it's a less rigorous analysis?
In Canada, faster will never mean a less rigorous analysis. I think the government's been pretty clear that it's important to maintain our ESG standards and our regulatory practices to maintain our position in the world as well. So the standards won't become less rigorous. I think what speeding up the process really just means providing more resources to those involved. So both the government having more internal resources in order to do the process, providing more resources to Indigenous nations to be able to manage the number of referrals that they're getting, starting discussions early so that you can actually understand what the issues might be that you have to address within an environmental assessment process, whether that be environmental or Indigenous rights related or whatever, so that you can, if you have to, change the project scope to address some of these things, you can do them early instead of having to do an amendment late in the day, which is just going to extend the process by several months or years. So no, I don't think it makes it less rigorous. I think it's just a matter of everyone putting the resources in to get it done.
So it can be done faster, is what you're saying.
It can be done faster. And part of that too is it's not just, proponents are also involved in this, right? So part of it is making sure that you've defined the scope of your project properly early on. There's a lot of factors involved in why the process takes as long as it does.
Thank you. Well, one of the questions that came in earlier has to do with the shares and the Securities Act roadblocks, I'm reading it here, to provide Indigenous groups project equity without being compensated financially. And the example they give is First Nations being, quote unquote, given equity as opposed to purchasing it. And that would be the perspective of the securities regulator, because they're used to seeing shares and money change hands, but that's not what we're talking about here. So Zach, do you want to talk a little bit about the securities regulation structure of that and the kind of concerns that arise?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, this actually came up for us recently on a transaction, on a deal we were working on where there was an agreement, consent-based IBA, where the nation, as one of the benefits from the company, was to be issued shares. And once the agreement was formalized, everyone thought they understood what timing looked like. And at the end of the day, found it took a lot longer. The securities regulator in this case wasn't really quickly wrapping their heads around the idea that consent had been provided, there's a value to that. Had the directors turn their mind to the best interests of the company around what that's worth. And I think for Sean and others in the room, I don't want to speak for you, but there's immense value to that. But making sure that everyone kind of understood at that level what it looked like, it took some time. And so in that circumstance, what our client found, unfortunately, is what it took was a lot of back and forth with the TSX to try and make clear everyone understood what the deal was. Then had to think about how do you disclose that deal. Luckily, it was drafted in such a way that it had that option. But then we had, of course, make sure that the nation understood why we were disclosing it, what the purpose was. And ultimately, it worked because the shares were at a de minimis level. But it's kind of a...
Can you just pause there and talk about what de minimis level means?
It was at a level of ownership in the company that didn't... it wasn't material to the business. It wasn't over 10% in this case. We're not really sure, in this scenario, it wasn't clear what was going to make the TSX not like the transaction better than what we had heard. But and frankly, in this scenario, TSX was dealing with another firm advising on the securities law aspect of it. But the long and short of it was the shares in that scenario were eventually issued, but it took quite some time to get there. And so practically it was a bit of a nightmare. Nation thought the company was holding itself up, not living up to its expectations and obligations under the agreement, when it's actually an external approval issue that wasn't foreseen by the Securities Council that was advising at the time.
And is there any perception that TSX, like having gone through that now once, might be a little better at it next time?
I hope so. But yeah, at the same time, I think it just really reinforced for us that needed to be sure that, it's all fine and good to say subject to and conditional upon a bunch of regulatory approvals, you're going to get some shares. Yeah. What does that mean in terms of timing? If it's not clear, expectations get missed, and that's a problem for a relationship, fundamentally.
And that's one of the risks we look at. That's one of the points we want that seat at the table. We want the own source revenue, because own source revenue that leads to real self-determination, right? So we don't want to be collecting operational dollars from ISC every year. We want to have own source revenue. So there's that risk that if you're getting shares from a company and something else negates the value of those shares from an incident that happens in another part of the world. Well, I didn't ask for this. Is now having an impact on my own source revenue. I'm glad I got the seat at the table, but now my own source revenue has been impacted. So I think they have to always find that solution that hits both of those.
I've got one question, then we got to... Oh, there we go.
Just, I'm curious to know, when you're issuing shares, are they issued to the nation or are they issued to the development corporation?
Typically, it's issued to an SPV, so there'll be a corp setup. Sorry, a special purpose vehicle, so a corporation, but also, as I mentioned, the preferred investment vehicle for a lot of nations, particularly First Nations, because of the flow through and liability aspect. It's a limited partnership, so in those circumstances, it's not chief and council holding the shares. Historically, there's situations where a chief and council may have held the shares on a trust and then transferred it to an SPV, but typically it's an SPV at this stage.
So Sean, you were talking about own source revenue there, and that brought to mind that equity doesn't provide predictable returns, whereas like a royalty-based payment or something akin to a production-based payment may be more predictable over time. How is that a concern for governments who kind of need to do budgets year to year?
Our nations or First Nation governments?
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're looking for, right? We're just looking to provide as much stable revenue. So that's why we'll use the ECDEV. So we'll put a number of investments within the portfolio and pump out a stable return back to the community. And so the whole goal is about a 20-year plan towards self-determination and to mitigate the federal dollars we receive. So we'll take some of those high risk investments. We'll take some really stable investments. This would just play in like any negotiation we're going into. We've talked about, do we want equity? No, we want that seat on the table that you will listen to our environmental knowledge keepers from a pre-production planning purpose, that will always have input while the mine site is ongoing, and that we have a strong seat at the table on reclamation and decommissioning. If those sort of things are achieved, then we'll talk socioeconomics. And the biggest socioeconomics for our community right now are job creation, business developments, and it's royalty sharing. So looking at production payments tied to uranium development. And within that, then you'll have price increases if the price jumps. You'll have floors. You'll have, if the mine stops, like so, you know, for instance, Cameco is in a pause, there's still obligations because there still are environmental impacts of them on a pause, right? So is it pure equity? No. But is it achieving what the nation wants? Yes.
There's a question over here.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you. So, I mean, you know, Kevin, you said the root of the kind of issue here is how do we accelerate things and make things happen faster? And Dani kind of touched on it, is how do you make something happen faster when the assessment is getting more and more rigorous? And, you know, from the Indigenous First Nation side, I'm coming from BC, so, you know, the government is implementing all these kind of consent and reconciliation-based principles associated with UNDRIP into the assessment processes. So at a surface level, you think, how could that possibly go any faster when things are getting more and more rigorous from multiple angles? And then you touched on resources and have all these entities having enough resources to address this in a kind of expeditious manner. So I'll put the question to all of you, but I'm particularly interested in your perspective, Sean, on capacity within the First Nations and Indigenous communities. And I know it's highly variable from region to region, and then even within region from nation and community, one to the other. But are there any kind of patterns you're seeing in kind of critical capacity gaps? And are there any kind of, what are the most actionable opportunities you can see to fill those gaps and help these nations and Indigenous communities address these processes efficiently while still respecting their own decision-making frameworks and timelines?
Yeah, okay. I'm always about, you got to give the community the opportunity to fill the gaps. It can't be used as an excuse. That's been used for the last 200 years. The community lacks capacity. You have some of the most pragmatic, ingenuity-based problem solvers in our northern communities, in all First Nation communities. So I'd rather see the opportunity outlined and allow communities to go out. There's been a growth. There's so much money right now in the Indigenous economy. You know, I do have some concerns that there's too many intermediaries in play, but some of them do serve a strong purpose. To go in and act to fill, I think First Nations, Métis, and your communities have to ask the questions. At one point, we will reach the capacity, and our consulting team will have to leave. They have to ask that question early up in stage but there are many out there that are, you know, you look at the number of First Nation organizations out there, the First Nations Major Project Coalition, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. There's there's a plethora of them, Max? Like, you could go to a conference a week right now, but they have to be monitored. They have to be measured like every other consulting sort of regime. But let's not use that as an excuse to give First Nations the opportunities. And I think resource companies have to look at ways to skin it in the cat differently, right? So maybe equity doesn't play with the project, but what about the infrastructure you're using, right? Maybe you're in a remote location that has to generate their own power. How do you allow the Indigenous community to own that? How do you allow the Indigenous community to own the airport, right? Or how do you allow there to be some spill-off benefit for future economic opportunities?
Those are some great points. I'd like to add that one of the keys, I think, on the proponent side is that you are out in the communities like early and you understand who it is that you need support from, and you are starting those conversations early, not during the process. You know, you don't give them your initial project description, start the process without having talked to them before. Because having those discussions early, you'll often uncover or discover what the interests are, how you can adjust the project. You might like to address those, which will all speed up the process and prevent issues from being raised kind of at the last minute. So I think that that's one of the keys, is making sure that you really are developing relationships early, as well as trying to understand what the interests and concerns might be with the project early on so that you can address them and figure things out, and then hopefully get to agreement early. It's not easy, it's not simple, but I think that's one of the keys is understanding the importance of partnering with Indigenous nations through the process.
Oh, go ahead, Sophie.
Yeah, sorry. I would just add to Dani's point of early engagement. I mean, this is all about Indigenous economic reconciliation. Everything that we're talking about here is going beyond the base minimum duty to consult. So we're all trying to get to the same place. And returning to early engagement, identification of issues, but also identifying where there are maybe gaps in capacity, being able to identify interest within the communities where they want to be building capacity and how proponents can be facilitating that. So even where, say within a community, they haven't had opportunities to develop a certain level of expertise within an area of services that they want to really be engaged in, being able to identify an interest early on and the game plan of how to get there, both from a supplier's perspective, but also employment, allows the parties to start building that capacity very early on and ensuring that everyone is ready to go once the project is developed.
Perfect. Question over here.
Hey, my name is Vardan Srivatsan. I'm with Narcan. I'm really enjoying this panel. I'm keenly interested in issues of equity, participation, and access to capital, but more broadly, I'm curious to hear about your views on how this intersects with, conversations around ESGI, on, corporate issuers or institutional investors kind of prioritizing Indigenous economic reconciliation and inclusion into their investment strategy. I'm wondering if you have any views on like going beyond the project by project basis on a more macro level. If you have views on how this dialogue is evolving, and if you think it's going at the right direction, or if if you have views contrary to that it needs to be directed towards something else beyond ESGI or something like that.
Question: You're asking whether if you pursue Indigenous equity, the market will essentially recognize that in terms of kind of being more advanced on ESGI, and therefore you may obtain some benefit or access to investment from funds that might otherwise have been not accessible to you. Is that?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm especially interested in Tron's views on this. If this is the right development or right kind of next step to thinking about this, or if there are other ways to think about it. So I'm just curious to hear any views on that.
I think it's going in the right direction, but I think it's still based off of the commodity being involved. So, for instance, you have two really good track records in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta with strong Indigenous participation. Probably two of the strongest examples in the country, but I don't think they're going to get extra ESG points because you're dealing with two commodities that are perceived to be negative. A uranium commodity, which, nuclear has never gotten strong ESG points and wasn't included in any of the sort of green bond framework. And then to move away from the investment in the oil sands region. But both those two examples are the strongest in the country of strong Indigenous inclusion. So I still think it's based on the commodity and some of the rhetoric from outside of Canada.
To add, though, when you're looking within the commodity itself, you want to obviously have a step ahead compared to your competitors, right? And so I do think it's a good point to be made that it's not just the regulatory process that's looking at Indigenous involvement. It will also be through investing, through ESG disclosure requirements, that type of thing moving forward. We've seen social issues being addressed by the SEC and major settlements being made with respect to employment standards and that type of thing. So it's inevitable that at some point this will also include, well, what is your relationship with Indigenous nations? What is the risk by not having relationships with Indigenous nations that include, project agreements or equity? So I think you're right. While this wasn't the focus of the discussion, it is a risk that's arising that companies should be aware of from that perspective as well.
I agree that equity participation isn't really going to help to materially accelerate project permitting. It can help avoid delays, which is really the only thing that we're looking at. It's how can we ensure that we complete the environmental assessment and permitting within these mandated timelines without delays. And yes, companies are often at fault for extending those schedules, but sometimes relationships with communities are too. I think Kevin's initial comment on project to permit is kind of an approach that governments are taking. But the other part about equity participation is in every single conversation I've had with First Nations in negotiating agreements over the last few years, the question of, would you consider equity participation, is part of the conversation. And it's not necessarily a revenue-based interest. It's an ownership-based interest that the nations are looking at in some cases. Simply, if a company has a right to produce for resource extraction, the nation is interested in owning a piece of that right. That's, in some cases, philosophically important to them. So that's something to consider. And I think industry really needs, and stock exchanges really need to look at how share awards can be adequately valued. And certainly for some nations, they've historically had typical milestone payments. And if you're replacing those with a share award, then you've got a mechanism for valuing those. But I think more broadly, going back to points that were made earlier, there needs to be a real set of guidelines developed for valuing share awards so that these situations don't get drawn out because nobody can make a decision.
Communities asking for participation in the project level or in the company as a whole?
Well, in my case, it's typically projects promoted by a junior company. So it's both project and company level at that stage. It's not like the situations you're dealing with Cameco, where the project level and the company level are very different.
Yeah.
The concerns that arise in those two contexts are very, very different. And so the idea of the delivery of shares in the context of a junior company where it might have one or two maybe projects has a more direct connection to sharing the benefit of that project, because likely that share price is going to go up and down with the success or failure of that project. But as you say, if it's in a larger company, Rio Tinto, BHP, then there may be an entire disconnect between the project that's local to you and the share price. One of the things we haven't covered, and we just got a couple minutes to do so, is one of the mechanisms that government has identified is guarantees as a way of accelerating a move towards equity. Zach, do you want to talk a little bit about the importance of the guarantee?
Sure. So we've had obviously the Alberta example with recently with the guarantees that are now being provided to essentially ensure that the debt obligations don't come through a nation. They're going to be third party backed. Third party's going to have, the owner's going to have a guaranteed loan from a parent, effectively from the government of Canada, or Alberta in this case, where that's going to provide enough certainty, security to advance project costs. There's nothing like that right now in BC. There's been calls for it. It's been a problem for projects we've been on in the mining space specifically, particularly in this context of nations not having access to capital and then not being able to finance the equity position, and then the project being told, well, there's just simply not security that can be granted from any side. So the limitations then outweigh the potential, and you're kind of back at square one. But would see that loan guarantee model in Alberta being hugely important. And Sophie, I don't know if you want to talk about the Ontario context and the energy sector, similar.
Yeah, not much to add on in the Ontario context. I mean, access to financing has been one of the main kind of barriers, impediments to Indigenous participation in meaningful projects. And this is going back to terms within the Indian Act and the inability to use reserve lands as collateral. So there are many complicating factors there, and what has resulted are some efforts within some levels of government to try to provide guarantees for Indigenous loans. There are also other organizations providing actual loans, like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, and Aboriginal financial institutions themselves are also popping up. So a lot of efforts are being spent to try to tackle this barrier with respect to financing, including the Ontario and the Alberta loan guarantee programs. In Ontario, the program was limited to energy projects, and oftentimes they will only guarantee up to a certain percentage of an equity interest. I think in Ontario it's 75%. So the Indigenous community is still left to try to finance the remaining portion of the 25% without that guarantee. So still some challenges, but work being done on that front.
I know we're unfortunately out of time, but that was a fascinating discussion. And Sean, if I could paraphrase something that I think I took from your comparison between Canada and Australia, is that if you just focus on one thing, whether it's equity or something else, you don't actually get there. It needs to be full inclusion, and equity needs to be on the table if we're going to get to where we want to, which is either faster permitting or less delayed permitting, to make that point. But please join me in thanking the panel. It was great work. So the last of our sessions in this series is later on today. Critical Minerals: Is the West Winning the Battle and Losing the War? That's at 4 o'clock today if you want to attend that. Other than that, thank you all for coming out and watching online. It's much appreciated. Have a great afternoon.